It's a weird time for the games industry. It's a weird time for Xbox, PlayStation, all the big publishers. It looks like things are probably getting worse before they get better. And there's kind of two big topics I want to hit and talk about, mostly just as a rant. So let's do that. So the basis of my two little rants I have here that I want to establish at first is that it's absolutely okay and expected and honestly justified to rip on and criticize and, if you want to, hate all of the big gaming publishers, all of the major platforms, all of the big studios and the people in charge of all those things, right? We're in this situation where really for like decades, but especially the last, 6, 7 years, we're in this situation that, like the pandemic happened. All of these companies went buck wild with cheap money. It was easy to get loans, to get financing, and all of these studios and publishers and platforms blew up and did acquisitions and started new studios and greenlit new games and did all of this stuff and just bloated like crazy because a lot of people were playing games and a lot of people were home and didn't have other stuff to do or couldn't do other things, right? And then in the years since, things kind of got back more to normal. And we started to see some hints of like, oh man, these studios are probably too big. Headcounts are probably too large. The too many projects got approved and then money wasn't so cheap anymore. So it wasn't so easy to get payroll loans and stuff like that. And we've seen the results of that in the last few years, but especially in these last year or two, as things have kind of gone bad. And not only are things contracting back to probably a more reasonable size with the industry and the number of games coming out and all of that, but it's probably shrinking a bit because of economy issues like tariffs and various events happening around the world and various countries behaving very strangely in recent years that have really screwed up a lot of the kind of world balances and economics and things like that. And now that is coming to roost. All of these studios and publishers and all of these teams that were just too big, were unsustainably large, are now getting cut down or gotten rid of entirely. And because of that, if you want to hate the decision makers and the big publishers and the big platforms or the big studios, go nuts. But I also think it's okay, if not essential, to make sure that you aren't, just gobbling up all of the crap around this that you can. And what I'm referencing specifically is the way that all of this stuff is getting talked about. So, we have this situation where it's okay for two things to be true at once. All of the greedy people and companies can be the bad guys, but that doesn't mean that anyone who calls them the bad guys are the good guys, right? And we're in this situation where if you're like me, if you're way too connected, if you're way too, online with all this stuff, what you've seen or what I've seen is a couple of like really annoying things when it comes to how this stuff is getting covered. The first thing is just every rumor, every hint of any potential, scoop or something that a journalist can get, or an influencer or content creator or whatever, it's just getting thrown out there. And because of the environment we're in, it's just getting gobbled up, believed, and spread around, right? Now, the games media industry is in a weird spot. You've got like little independent content creators and influencers that have bigger audiences than like IGN, even though they aren't really any more particularly informed or smart or nuanced. But then even the IGNs and the Kotakus and the VGCs and all this are populated by mostly journalists who are just, like content creators with notepads, right? You have these tiers of journalists in the games industry, just like you do in any, media, I'm sure. But you have like maybe a half dozen actual journalists who cover games, and even they have their own problems. And then you have like a few dozen people who are like maybe a little more serious, but not like, completely, like very well educated or experienced journalists, but they do good work. They tend to have good sourcing. They tend to not be overly biased in one way or the other. And then you just have hundreds of people who are just writing slop articles. And like if you ever see an article on VGC or Eurogamer that you don't like, click on the author, and there's a pretty good chance that person's publishing like 8 articles a day. They're just slopping it out, and that sucks, right? What I think has bothered me, especially over the last few weeks, are 2 things with this part of my rant. Is one, like I said, everything's just being taken seriously and getting pushed like it's serious. So we're having these situations where, like with Xbox, a studio is at risk is closing. Will be the first story. Then the next story will be, well, a studio is in negotiations for their future. Maybe they'll, go indie. Maybe they'll get picked up by another publisher or a buyer. Maybe they will get shut down. Maybe they'll just get, absorbed into another studio or something. And then the story just disappears. But in the meantime, this same story comes up with a half dozen studios, right? And that's what's happened with Xbox over the last month or so, since Asha Sharma and her team put out this reset blog talking about how the challenges they're dealing with and the things that they're going to have to do to, meet those challenges, right? And it's been interesting because it could be reported in a way of, hey, here's what they might do. Here's, why they would do that. And here's the justification that they're going to use for it. And you can even in that still be like, and we think that sucks and that's BS. Fair play. But that's not what's happening. All it is just a person on Reddit thinks that this is going to happen. A game developer who hasn't been in the industry for 20 years has a podcast and said he heard things are going to be bad. Like we're getting a bunch of that kind of news instead of like news. Right? News and explanation and nuance and context, right? And I think that's what's so frustrating to me. Like, I expect regular gamers and small content creators like myself to basically be full of crap and to just be clickbaiting all the time because they don't really know anything. No one really understands the industry or how things work. And so there's just a bunch of static and noise and crap out there, right? And then we get to those tiers of journalists I talked about. We're like, that second tier of people who like, maybe they're not the most professional, but they have some sources and they have the ability to put out some actual info, even if it's skewed and cut up with a lot of, engagement bait or clickbait or whatever. And then there's like half dozen people who like really should be like the basis of news when it comes to video games and explaining why these things are happening. And instead, they're just all doing the same thing. They're just jumping on the next rumor, trying to be the first on the next scoop. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter because in 2 days, everyone's going to forget about that story because you're going to have the next story, the next scoop, the next rumor. And like, when it comes to these Xbox layoffs that are coming up, there's a good chance that as this video releases, they're happening. There's a really good chance that as I'm talking about this, like 5 studios have been shut down at Xbox, a bunch of games have been canceled, and everyone's freaking out, right? I'm not even disputing that can or can't happen or is going to happen or not. It probably is in some capacity. There's too much smoke without fire, right? But it's the coverage of it that has been really frustrating for me, and that it's all about being the first to have the scoop, whether it's real or not. And there's no, and it gets portrayed, it's very performative. It's very like trying to pretend like these people care about the devs who are going to lose their jobs and all this, but it clearly isn't, because they'll just run with any rumor that they find, whether it's true or not, whether it has good sourcing or not. And I found that people struggle, the people especially who are putting this stuff out, that if you push back on them, then you automatically are a shill and you're defending the bad guys, right? And that's and the whole point of this is that I don't think that's true. I think you can go after the people doing bad reporting, bad, news, bad, coverage of all of this stuff around gaming, but especially, these layoffs and studio shuttering. You can push back on people doing a bad job at that while also thinking that the actual things happening suck. I think it's okay to say the things they're doing suck. Maybe we shouldn't talk this much about them though until we know what they're doing. Maybe we shouldn't spend weeks almost like rooting for layoffs. And while none of these, outlets and journalists are necessarily doing that outright, it kind of is what they're doing. They're, they're almost hyping it up like a sporting event that's coming up, right? And that just, it's really bothered me. It's really annoyed me, especially because there's so little pushback on the people doing that. Real news, actual development, explanations of what's going on, that should be celebrated and loved and paid lots of attention to, but it probably doesn't sell. It doesn't get clicks. So instead we get what we're getting, and I think that sucks. The second part of this, which is involved with that, is still acknowledging that all the companies, all the people making decisions, they can suck. They can be the worst. They can be selfish or be bad at what they're doing. Fine, like acknowledged, right? But I also wish there was anyone, any journalist or any like notable influencer taking the side of, I hate this, but here's why they're doing it. Xbox specifically, we have this situation where there's 5 studios right now that seem like they're probably in danger of being shut down or sold off or to go, split off to go indie or absorbed into other studios or whatever, right? It's Arcane Leon, Compulsion, Ninja Theory, Undead Labs, and Double Fine. And what I feel like we're missing out on is a single smart person who knows how to write well, who has some influence to say, hey, I hate this. I hate this for the art of gaming. I hate this for the people who work at these studios. I hate this for the gaming culture as a whole. But here's why these studios are all probably going to get shut down. And here's why, from a business perspective, that makes sense, but that doesn't mean it feels good, and it doesn't mean that you have to like it. You can hate this, even if it makes complete sense, right? And I think that's kind of where I've landed at this point of Arcane Leon. They're working on Blade that they announced years ago, and we've literally seen one cinematic trailer for. Blade is an MCU franchise that has zero motion. No one cares about Blade. They made some movies in the 90s. They were awful. I don't care. I'm sorry. They were bad. And at least that's my hot take. And they have no relevance today. Blade is an irrelevant franchise today. Maybe this could bring that up. Probably won't. It's like making a Spawn game in 2026. Their last game was Deathloop, and before that, they had some successful games. It's been quite a while though. Deathloop was okay. It was about as mediocre as a game can get. This is also the Arcane that there was Arcane Austin that made Redfall, and previously had made Prey, which was a really good game, but it was 10 years earlier. And then they made Redfall, which is one of the most dreadful games I've ever played. Arcane Leon probably shouldn't still be around, and if they didn't get acquired with ABK to Xbox, they probably wouldn't be. Compulsion. Neat studio. South of Midnight, beautiful game, great music, cool characters, good story. Bad game. Not a fun game to play. Combat's terrible, platforming, mediocre. Not a great game. Didn't sell well, didn't make a lot of motion, no one cared about it. They've been a studio for 17 years. They've released 3 games, 2 of them were bad. South of Midnight was okay. That's not sustainable. That doesn't work. Compulsion wouldn't be around today if they hadn't been acquired by Xbox. Ninja Theory. This one is hard for me because we are under the impression they were somewhat viable, but we kind of run into a similar situation. Hellblade 1 comes out, PlayStation exclusive, timed, eventually comes to Xbox. Xbox acquires them. Xbox gives them the funds and the freedom to make Hellblade 2. Hellblade 2 is a 8-hour walking simulator that a lot of people end up not really liking. I loved it. I think it's still the pinnacle of this generation of gaming. But, it was a pretty, underwhelming experience at the end of the day when a lot of people, including myself, were expecting this to be a huge step up from the first game. And it was just basically a similar experience. And they have Senua coming out, which is going to be kind of what I think people more expected from Hellblade 2. Might be too little too late. The studio has probably cost them a insane amount of money with very little return. Undead Labs. Huge hit with State of Decay 1. Barely spent any money on it. Barely marketed it. Ended up being a huge hit, all things considered. State of Decay 2 comes, 4 or 5 years later. Releases in 2018. Really rough at launch. But they get acquired by Xbox right after the launch of the game. That support, leads to them supporting State of Decay 2 in one of the best supports of live service I've ever seen for a video game. Game supposedly reaches 10 million players. I don't have any idea how that happened because the game has no motion. No one ever talks about it outside of their community, which is very dedicated, but still reaches a lot of players, I guess. I love the game, one of my favorite games ever, but it still is what it is, right? And then we wait, 8 more years. It's going to end up being 9 years by the time State of Decay 3 is probably going to come out. And now we're in the situation where we find out that, sounds like the culture there is pretty toxic and it's not run very well. Sounds like a lot of money got wasted and a lot of thumbs were twiddled, and development of State of Decay 3 took way longer than it probably should have. When you see the result is a game that looks better than 2, for sure, quality wise, still doesn't quite look like a huge AAA experience that maybe it should be after all this time. I find out that they have a second studio that they opened with a motion capture studio, and for some reason, right? Maybe it will come to good use, but it seems like maybe they dawdled a bit, and we can't do that right now. And then we have Double Fine, who is legendary, right? We have a legendary person running it. People love Psychonauts, but Psychonauts 2 came out a really long time ago. And since then, they made a movie about a game about a lighthouse that you barely play, and a multiplayer game about pottery. Cool ideas, not sustainable, not making money, losing money only. And there's rumors they're making Psychonauts 3. We haven't seen anything about it. Who knows how far away it is? These 5 studios are great. Have great people working there, have great ideas, make fun, interesting, cool games. But in especially the current market, fun and cool, good vibes isn't where we're at. We're not at the good vibe state of making video games. And when, a month ago plus, we have a blog about, this platform, this publisher that needs to get down to the basics and get back to what they're good at, and get back to trying to be profitable and be a good business. All of this good vibe stuff isn't going to do that. And that's why these things are happening. And I'm not seeing anyone make that argument. And I'm not saying you have to make that argument and take the side of the corporations and the bad decision makers. I'm saying that you should present this argument and then maybe take it down. Then give a good argument or a good reason why Double Fine and Undead Labs and all these studios should be around and why they're good for Xbox and all that. But that's not happening. And I think that's a big part of my frustration here. There's that you get into the console war stuff. Like, I'm an Xbox fan. I make that very clear. I'm definitely biased with all that. But, we go back to the coverage and we talk about how like Bungie just cut their studio in half. They fired 300 to 400 workers. 400 is around the number. If all 5 of these studios get closed at Xbox, it's going to be 400 to 500 developers. That's insane. That's a tragedy. It's a huge loss to the industry. It's awful. But that Bungie story got covered for a minute, and we've been hearing about these Xbox layoffs for weeks. And I just don't I don't expect it to be the other way around. I don't expect everyone to harp on these Bungie layoffs for weeks and then barely mention the Xbox ones. I just feel like maybe these things should be treated more equally. And it's not just those 2 brands. It includes, shady stuff that Nintendo does that never gets talked about. Shady stuff that EA and Ubisoft and Embracer and, Tencent and NetEase and all these publishers and funding sources do. Like, it seems like the coverage is uneven, but that's probably a different video. I guess my point in this little mini blog or podcast or whatever is just that please understand that, at least from my perspective, it's completely possible to demonize the corporations who made bad decisions and now innocent people are going to suffer from them, while also criticizing journalists and influencers who are being very performative, I think, and very opportunistic about outrage and pretending to care about things they don't, and people they don't really care about. And also to understand why these moves are being made, even if you don't like them. Bad corporations, bad coverage, bad journalists, bad influencers, understandable, but awful decisions. That's the basis of this video. Tear me up in the comments or agree with me. I don't really care. Thanks for listening. If you want more gaming videos from me, subscribe, hit the like button so more people see it. Leave a comment down below, I guess. Become a premium YouTube member if you want videos like this one a bit early. Check out my other links down in the description for other content, other ways to support. That's all I've got for this one. Until next time.